The metallic sound of a shotgun shell racking into a chamber cut through the Louisiana night. Then another, and another. 4 black men stood in full view of the police, deliberately loading their weapons as teenage protesters faced down fire hoses aimed at their faces. The officers froze. They'd used these tactics in Birmingham, Montgomery, Selma. Dogs, hoses, batons. It always worked. But nobody had ever pointed guns back at them before. The police ordered the fire truck to withdraw. July 8th, 1965. Bogalusa, Louisiana. A white mob surrounded peaceful civil rights marchers outside City Hall, hurling rocks, closing in for the attack that would send them running like they always did. Then 3 shots cracked across the crowd. A white man dropped, hit in the chest. The mob scattered in seconds, and for the first time in the history of the American civil rights movement, a black man had shot a white man in self-defense during a demonstration and lived to tell about it. His name was Henry Austin. He was 21 years old, and he was a deacon for defense and justice. This is the story that history tried to forget. The story of Black World War II and Korean War veterans who came home from fighting for freedom abroad and decided to fight for it at home. Not with sit-ins, not with marches, not by turning the other cheek. With loaded M1 rifles, military discipline, and a simple promise. If you come to kill us, we will kill you first. When the Ku Klux Klan came riding through black neighborhoods at midnight, these men were waiting in the darkness. When white mobs attacked civil rights workers, these men formed armed perimeters. When Martin Luther King Jr. preached non-violence, these men said, "God bless you, but we'll be over here with the shotguns." And in 4 short years, they did something no one thought possible. They made the Klan afraid. The northern Louisiana mill town of Jonesboro seemed like an unlikely birthplace for armed resistance. Population 5,000, half black, half white, entirely segregated. The paper mill paid the wages. Jim Crow wrote the rules, and by 1964, those rules were being challenged by the Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE. CORE had established a freedom house in Jonesboro that spring, bringing in young activists, many of them white, to help register black voters. Their presence enraged white Jonesboro. To the local Klan, these outside agitators represented everything they feared about the changing South. So in July 1964, the Klan decided to make an example of them. 5 black churches burned. The Masonic Hall burned. A Baptist center burned. All in the space of a few weeks. The Freedom House itself came under repeated attack. Shots fired through windows at night. Rocks through windshields during the day. The pattern was familiar throughout the South. Terror without consequence. Violence without arrest. But Jonesboro had something most rural southern towns didn't have. It had a significant population of black men who'd fought in World War II and Korea. Men who knew how to handle weapons. Men who'd faced enemy fire on 2 continents. Men who'd been promised that their service to their country would mean something when they came home. They'd been lied to. Ernest Thomas had been born in Jonesboro on November 20th, 1935. He'd grown up fighting white boys for access to swimming holes, learning early that rights went to those who fought for them, not to those who asked politely. After military service, he'd returned home believing that political change had to be secured by force, not moral appeal. The Klan's July rampage proved him right. Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick had been named after the great abolitionist. Born in 1933 in Haynesville, Louisiana, he'd excelled at grambling, earning a degree in biology while playing football. His imposing physical presence made him hard to ignore. His education made him hard to dismiss, and his position as gym teacher at the segregated black high school gave him access to the community's young men. Before the convoy, 2 separate groups had already formed to protect Corps workers. Thomas led one group of sentries who guarded the Freedom House at night. Kirkpatrick organized another that monitored police arrests and worked to keep the community safe. Both groups were informal, unorganized, reactive. The July Klan convoy changed everything. Thomas and Kirkpatrick met with about 20 other men in November 1964. Most were veterans. All were tired. Tired of watching their churches burn. Tired of watching their children terrorized. Tired of being told to wait, to be patient, to let the system work. The system was working, just not for them. They called themselves the Deacons for Defense and Justice. The name was strategic. Deacon implied respectability, religious values, community service. It made them sound like a church group. which is exactly what they wanted white folks to think. What they actually were was a disciplined armed self-defense organization with clear rules. Never fire first. Always fire back. Protect civil rights workers, their families, and the black community. Use military tactics, military discipline, military precision. The Deacons established membership criteria that would have made the Army proud. Men only, over 21, American citizens, married men with military service preferred, registered voters, no hotheads. Anyone with a reputation for starting trouble was rejected. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protection. They organized CB radio networks and walkie-talkies for communication. They ran nighttime patrols through black neighborhoods in cars. They stationed armed guards outside the Freedom House, and they made sure everyone, black and white, knew they were there. In early 1965, black students in Jonesboro picketed the local high school, demanding integration. Hostile police arrived with fire trucks, preparing to turn hoses on the teenagers. It was Bull Connor's playbook, proven effective in Birmingham. Then a car pulled up carrying 4 Deacons. In full view of the police, these men calmly loaded their shotguns. The metallic sound of shells racking into chambers carried across the street. The police looked at the shotguns. They looked at the men holding them, men who clearly knew how to use them, and they ordered the fire truck to withdraw. It was the first time in the 20th century that an armed black organization had successfully used weapons to defend a lawful protest against an attack by law enforcement. The students continued their protest, unmolested. Word spread about the men with guns, about the Klan backing down, about a new kind of resistance. Then core workers in Jonesboro shared something remarkable. After the successful library integration, the Ku Klux Klan burned crosses in response, as they always did. But the Deacons wrote leaflets threatening to kill anyone who burned another cross. They had black housekeepers distribute these leaflets directly into white homes. The cross burnings stopped. In February 1965, Kirkpatrick and Thomas received an urgent message from Bogalusa, Louisiana, 300 miles to the southeast. Black activists there were under siege. They needed help. February 21st, 1965. The day Malcolm X was shot in New York, Kirkpatrick, Thomas, and a Corps field secretary traveled to Bogalusa to organize the Second Deacons chapter. If Jonesboro had been difficult, Bogalusa was a nightmare. The city of 22,000 was a company town, dominated by Crown Zellerbach, a massive paper mill operation. Roughly 40% of residents worked for the company. 70% of the city's taxes came from Crown Zellerbach employees, and approximately 100 of those employees were Ku Klux Klan members. The mill embodied segregation. Black workers couldn't eat with whites, couldn't sit in the same break rooms, couldn't use the same restrooms, couldn't hold supervisory positions no matter how qualified. They did the hardest, dirtiest, most dangerous work for the lowest wages. When they complained, they got fired. When they organized, they got killed. In early 1965, Washington Parish hired its first black deputy sheriffs. Within weeks, both were targeted. One was Ambas, innated. The other barely survived an attack in the small town of Varnado, just north of Bogalusa. The killers were never apprehended. The message was clear. Black people in positions of authority would be removed by any means necessary. Into this environment stepped 3 men who would lead the Bogalusa Deacons: Robert Hicks, A.Z. Young, and Charles Sims. All worked at Crown Zellerbach. All had reached their breaking point. Charles Sims became the face of the Bogalusa Deacons. A World War II veteran, he was described by journalists as grizzled, intimidating, with beady eyes and a gap where 2 teeth should be. Jet magazine called him the man most feared by whites in Louisiana. When reporters asked if he'd ever been arrested for battery, Sims estimated about 20 times. When they asked, battery with what? He just held up his fists. But Sims's public persona as a tough guy masked something more important: tactical discipline. He understood that protection required deterrence, and deterrence required fear. If white segregationists believed the Deacons were more dangerous than they actually were, so much the better. The goal wasn't to fight. It was to make sure fighting never became necessary. Robert Hicks had publicly demanded that black workers at the mill receive equal promotion opportunities. This made him a target. In early 1965, a coffin appeared in his yard with his name painted on the side. A burning cross accompanied it. The Klan's traditional calling card: stop your agitation or die. Hicks didn't stop. The Deacons made sure he didn't have to. The Bogalusa chapter grew rapidly. Deacons established 24-hour armed guard rotations around Hicks's home and the homes of other activists. They patrolled black neighborhoods in vehicles equipped with CB radios. They created quick response teams that could be anywhere in the city within minutes. And they made one thing absolutely clear. If you attacked a black person in Bogalusa, you would be shot. In spring 1965, a young deacon named Henry Austin, a 21-year-old insurance collector, finished his rounds in Washington Parish as the sun set. Heading back toward Bogalusa down a dirt road, he noticed headlights behind him. They came closer, too close. Austin realized he was being pursued by Klansmen. The cars chased him to a bridge. They pulled alongside, trying to force him off the road. Austin had two choices: die or fight. He chose to fight. Opening fire with his pistol through his own car window, he hit the lead vehicle. It swerved, missed the bridge, and ran into the water. Austin escaped. The next day, shaken but alive, he went to see Charles Sims and formally joined the Deacons. Within months, Austin would do something unprecedented in the civil rights movement. The Congress of Racial Equality continued its work in Bogalusa throughout the spring and summer of 1965, testing the new Civil Rights Act by attempting to integrate public facilities. The Klan response was immediate and violent. White mobs threw rocks at peaceful marchers. Police stood by and watched. Sometimes they joined in. On July 8, 1965, hundreds of white opponents gathered outside Bogalusa City Hall to confront civil rights marchers. The crowd grew hostile, surrounding the protesters, throwing objects. Violence seemed inevitable. Henry Austin, now a deacon, was there providing security. A white man named Alton Crow confronted the crowd of black demonstrators, advancing aggressively. Austin drew his pistol and fired 3 times, hitting Crow in the chest. The mob dispersed instantly. Crow survived. So did Austin. And that night, Charles Sims reportedly said to FBI informants, a brand new Negro was born. It was the first time during the civil rights movement that a black man had shot a white man in self-defense during a demonstration and survived to tell about it. The psychological impact rippled through both communities. For black residents of Bogalusa, it proved that armed self-defense worked. For white segregationists, it proved the rules had changed. Corps leader James Farmer needed to come to Bogalusa to speak at the funeral of one of the assassinated black deputies. Police warned him the Klan was planning to shoot him. Farmer, one of the principal architects of non-violent civil rights protest, called the Deacons. 4 armed deacons met Farmer at the New Orleans airport. They drove him 65 miles to Bogalusa in a convoy, weapons visible, radios coordinating. They provided security at the funeral, where approximately 50 deacons attended. No one was attacked. Farmer survived, and afterward, he told the press something that shocked civil rights leaders across the country. Corps is non-violent, but we have no right to tell black people in Bogalusa or anywhere else that they do not have the right to defend their homes. Even Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference employed armed guards, though they rarely discussed it publicly. King himself, during the early days of the Montgomery bus boycott, had kept guns in his home. The difference was visibility. The deacons didn't hide their weapons. They displayed them openly, deliberately, strategically. On a July night in 1965, a cavalcade of 25 Klan cars drove through a black neighborhood in Bogalusa, hurling insults, randomly firing into houses. The Klan had done this hundreds of times before, in dozens of towns, always with the same result: terror without resistance. This time, the neighborhood fired back. Dozens of rifles and pistols opened up on the convoy. Klansmen, shocked to be under attack, sped away in panic. Some vehicles running into ditches in their haste to escape. They never came back. One deacon leader remembered, they finally found out that we really are men, and that we would do what we said, and we meant what we said. The escalating violence forced the federal government's hand. The Department of Justice, which had been reluctant to challenge local police departments that collaborated with the Klan, finally acted. In July 1965, using Reconstruction-era laws, federal authorities ordered local police to protect civil rights workers. FBI agents flooded the region. Federal prosecutors began building cases against Klan members. By the end of 1965, the Louisiana Klan had been devastated. Membership collapsed. Cross burnings nearly ceased. Night riding stopped. Federal surveillance and prosecution, combined with armed black resistance, had accomplished what decades of non-violent protest alone could not. The Deacons expanded rapidly. On March 8, 1965, they formally incorporated as a Louisiana non-profit organization with an explicit mission: the defense of civil rights, property rights, and personal rights. By mid-1965, chapters existed across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and even in Chicago. At their peak, the Deacons had approximately 21 chapters and 46 affiliates. They provided security for major civil rights events. In 1966, when James Meredith, the first black student at the University of Mississippi, was shot during his March Against Fear, the Deacons joined the continuation march from Memphis to Jackson, providing armed escorts. At night campsites, Deacons stood guard. Martin Luther King Jr., despite his philosophical opposition to armed resistance, accepted their protection during parts of the march. He understood that in rural Mississippi, non-violence alone could get you killed. Charles Sims articulated the Deacons' philosophy in an August 1965 interview. "The reason why we had to organize the Deacons in the city of Bogalusa was the black people and civil rights workers didn't have no adequate police protection. When the white power structure found out that they had men, black men that had made up their minds to stand up for their people and to die if necessary for their people, they started acting a little different." Asked about the Second Amendment, Sims was direct. "I think a person should have the right to carry a weapon in self-defense. We found out in Bogalusa that the Louisiana state law that says a man can carry a weapon in his car as long as it's not concealed meant for the white man. It didn't mean for the colored." The Deacons operated under strict rules of engagement. They pledged their lives for the defense of justice and their community, but only in defensive situations. Charles Sims repeatedly emphasized this to members and media. "We will never go on the offense. But if the Klan or anybody else comes in here to hit us, I guarantee they will get hit back." This discipline separated them from vigilantes. They weren't seeking revenge or starting fights. They were establishing boundaries and enforcing them. The fact that those boundaries were backed by men with combat experience and loaded weapons made them real in a way that court orders and federal laws were not. The Federal Bureau of Investigation took notice. By mid-1965, the FBI had opened an investigation into the Deacons, classifying them as a potential black extremist organization. Bureau Director J. Edgar Hoover ordered intensive surveillance, fearing the group would spark a race war. FBI agents infiltrated chapters, recruited informants, tracked weapons purchases, and monitored communications. They documented everything: membership lists, training procedures, weapon types, patrol routes. The investigation files would eventually total over 600 pages. But the FBI found something unexpected. The Deacons' presence actually reduced violence. Areas with active Deacons chapters saw fewer Klan attacks, fewer shootings, fewer nighttime raids. Armed deterrence worked. The Deacons' effectiveness in Bogalusa had additional consequences. Robert Hicks, the activist whose home had been threatened with the coffin, turned to the court system in late 1965 to challenge workplace discrimination at Crown Zellerbach. His lawsuit, backed by federal civil rights enforcement and protected by the Deacons, opened previously closed job opportunities and promotions for black workers at the mill. The combination of federal legal action, armed self-defense, and organized protest proved more effective than any single approach alone. Black voter registration in the region increased dramatically. By the late 1960s, black residents were serving in law enforcement positions throughout rural Louisiana, something unthinkable just years earlier. But success brought complications. The Black Power movement, emerging in 1966 with Stokely Carmichael's famous call in Mississippi, attracted national attention. The Black Panther Party, founded that same year in Oakland, California, adopted some of the Deacons' tactics but added revolutionary rhetoric that the Deacons had always avoided. Charles Sims rejected black power as a concept. "I don't want to live under black power," he said. "I don't want to live under white power. I want equal power, and that's what I push." He dismissed Carmichael as a show-off. "I don't see nothing they were doing to even be talking about no black power," Sims said. "The black power, we had it. In them 30 rounds of ammunition on a man's shoulder, we had the black power." The Deacons were apolitical except for civil rights and self-defense. They rejected attempts by black nationalists and white communists to recruit them to broader ideological causes. They were working men, veterans, family men. They weren't revolutionaries. They just wanted to protect their community and enforce their constitutional rights. As federal civil rights enforcement improved, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 began changing the political landscape, the acute need for armed self-defense diminished. The Deacons had forced the federal government to intervene. Once that intervention came, their role became less critical. By 1968, Deacons' activity had declined significantly. The Black Panther Party, with its more militant rhetoric and urban focus, captured media attention and overshadowed the rural, working-class, defensive approach of the Deacons. The FBI, concerned about urban riots and revolutionary movements, shifted its surveillance away from the Deacons toward these newer organizations. The Deacons never completely disbanded, but they faded from public view. Their story was largely forgotten, overshadowed by the more visible narrative of non-violent resistance led by Martin Luther King Jr. History books mentioned them briefly, if at all. The civil rights movement, as taught in schools, emphasized peaceful protests and moral suasion, not armed veterans establishing defensive perimeters. Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick moved to New York, became a minister, and dedicated himself to teaching Black history through music. He recorded several albums with Smithsonian Folkways, including songs honoring civil rights leaders and the Deacons themselves. He died in 1986. Charles Sims remained in Bogalusa, continuing to advocate for equal rights through legal means. Robert Hicks stayed active in the community until his death in 2010. His home was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2015, recognized as the birthplace of the Bogalusa Deacons chapter. Plans for a civil rights museum at the site continue. Ernest Thomas's later life remains less documented, but his role as co-founder ensured his place in the hidden history of armed resistance during the civil rights movement. In 2003, Showtime produced a television movie, Deacons for Defense, directed by Bill Duke and starring Forrest Whitaker and Ossie Davis. It brought the story to a new generation, though like all dramatizations, it simplified complex events. The Deacons' legacy raises uncomfortable questions about the civil rights movement's dominant narrative. For decades, the movement has been presented as a story of non-violent moral triumph over violent oppression. Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy of redemptive suffering through non-violence is taught as the strategy that won. But the Deacons tell a different story. They suggest that non-violent protest succeeded in part because it was backed by the implicit threat of armed resistance. They demonstrate that federal intervention often came not from moral appeals alone, but from the specter of armed conflict that the government wanted to prevent. They prove that working-class Black veterans, not just college-educated leaders, played crucial roles in securing civil rights. Most significantly, they show that Black people throughout the South had always defended themselves when possible, had always fought back when necessary. The Deacons didn't invent armed resistance. They organized it, publicized it, and made it a visible part of the civil rights struggle. Lance Hill, a historian who wrote the definitive book on the Deacons, noted something remarkable. The Deacons' local campaigns frequently resulted in substantial victories that self-sustaining organizations, producing real power that survived after national civil rights groups departed. In Jonesboro, the Deacons compelled Louisiana Governor John McKeithen to intervene in the city's civil rights crisis, the first time a Deep South governor capitulated to the civil rights movement. In Bogalusa, they forced federal intervention that broke the Klan's power. These weren't symbolic victories. They were concrete changes in power relations, enforced not by moral suasion, but by armed men who'd decided they would no longer be victims. The standard narrative of the civil rights movement emphasizes that violence was the tool of oppressors, that meeting violence with violence was morally wrong and tactically foolish. The Deacons complicate that narrative. They met violence with the credible threat of violence. And it worked. This doesn't diminish the importance of non-violent protest. Sit-ins, freedom rides, marches. These tactics mobilized public opinion, attracted media coverage, and created moral pressure on political leaders. But in rural Louisiana and Mississippi, where federal marshals were absent and local police were Klansmen, non-violent protesters needed protection. The Deacons provided it. One Deacon member told an interviewer, "If the Deacons had been organized in 1964, the 3 civil rights workers that was assassinated in Philadelphia, Mississippi, might have been living today because we'd have been around to protect them." He was referring to James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, murdered by Klansmen and buried in an earthen dam, their deaths shocking the nation. Would armed guards have saved them? Impossible to know, but the fact remains. In areas where deacons operated, civil rights workers survived. In areas without that protection, some didn't. The deacons represented something that made civil rights organizations nervous and historians uncomfortable. The American tradition of armed self-defense applied to black people. The Second Amendment, that constitutional right white Americans had always claimed, exercised by black veterans who'd earned it in combat. When Charles Sims said, "Let's back up the Constitution of the United States and say we can bear arms," he was claiming a right that had been systematically denied to black Americans since slavery. Armed black people threatened the entire structure of white supremacy, which depended on the threat of violence going only one direction. The deacons reversed that equation. They made violence bidirectional. They made the Klan afraid. And that fear, combined with federal action and non-violent protest, helped break Jim Crow's back in Louisiana. On July 8, 1965, when Henry Austin fired those 3 shots into Alton Crow's chest, he didn't just save himself and the protesters around him. He fired a shot heard across the South. The message, "Black people will defend themselves. The cost of racial terrorism has gone up. Calculate accordingly." The Klan calculated. Cross burnings decreased. Night riding stopped. Attacks on civil rights workers declined. Not because segregationists had a change of heart, but because they'd done the math. Some targets shot back now, and those who shot back were combat veterans who didn't miss. The Deacon's story challenges comfortable narratives about how social change happens. It suggests that moral arguments alone don't transform power structures, that sometimes violence, or the credible threat of it, is necessary to secure basic rights, that working-class black people with guns were as important as middle-class black people with law degrees. This is why the Deacons were largely written out of civil rights history. They didn't fit the story civil rights leaders wanted to tell, or that white America wanted to hear. King's dream was palatable to white liberals. Armed black veterans shooting at white men was not. But the Deacons weren't trying to be palatable. They were trying to survive. They were trying to protect their families, their neighbors, their communities. They were using skills learned in the service of their country to defend rights supposedly guaranteed by that country's constitution. Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick, Charles Sims, Ernest Thomas, Robert Hicks, Henry Austin, and the hundreds of men who joined them weren't heroes in the traditional civil rights narrative. They were heroes in a different kind of story. A story about men who came home from war expecting to be treated as citizens, and finding that expectation betrayed, used their military training to demand what had been promised. They didn't defeat the Klan through moral superiority. They defeated them through superior firepower, superior tactics, and superior discipline. They turned the Klan's weapons against them. They made white supremacists calculate risk, and they proved that when black veterans decided to defend their community, even the Ku Klux Klan backed down. This was never just about guns. It was about dignity, about refusing to be victims, about saying to a system built on black subjugation, "We will not go quietly. We will not beg. We will not wait for your permission. We fought for this country. We are citizens, and we will defend ourselves." Charles Sims, grizzled and gap-toothed, standing in Bogalusa with a rifle across his lap, represented something white supremacy couldn't survive. A black man who refused to be afraid. Multiply that man by hundreds, arm them with military training and modern weapons, organize them with military discipline, and you have what the Deacons for Defense and Justice actually were. Not a revolutionary army, not black nationalists, just American veterans exercising their constitutional rights. When the shooting finally stopped, when the Klan retreated, when federal law enforcement finally arrived to do its job, the Deacons had accomplished something historians still struggle to fully acknowledge. They had protected their community through armed resistance, forced government intervention through the threat of escalating violence, and proved that sometimes the only effective response to terror is the credible promise of retaliation. In Jonesboro, Louisiana, in November 1964, when Ernest Thomas and Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick called that first meeting of combat veterans, they weren't starting a revolution. They were finishing one. The revolution begun by black soldiers who fought in 2 world wars, came home to Jim Crow, and decided they'd fought their last war for other people's freedom. This time, they'd fight for their own. The Deacons for Defense and Justice existed for less than 4 years as an active organization, but in that time, they changed the calculation of racial violence in the Deep South. They proved that black communities could defend themselves. They forced the federal government to intervene. And they demonstrated that the Second Amendment applied to black veterans too, whether white supremacists liked it or not. When history remembers the civil rights movement, it remembers the marches, the sit-ins, the speeches, the songs. It should also remember the sound of shotguns racking rounds into chambers, the sight of combat veterans standing guard, and the moment the Ku Klux Klan realized that this time, someone would shoot back.